Yeah, well, firstly, I was just saying thank you very much for joining this morning. It's great to have you here because you were on the roundtable the other day and everything you shared was absolutely fascinating. So I thought it'd be great to understand a little bit about what got you into agroforestry. You know, how did you even get into being in the natural world and into farming? Yeah, and just we'd love to explore a little bit about kind of your visions as well. So, yeah, over to you.
Awesome. Yeah, well, thank you for having me first. Super nice to be talking with you again. It's really nice to be part of this community. So I really appreciate being here. Oh God, yeah, where to begin, right? With how did I start to be working with agroforestry? Well, I think maybe a good approach to talk about how I came into it would be a few specific examples rather than sort of rambling on about a whole story. But basically, I grew up in North Wales, out in the countryside, in the middle of nowhere, and my time was spent completely outside. You know, if I was ever told off by my parents, I would just run off into the woods and, you know, build a fire or something. So right from the beginning, I was outside in the woods. My family has a family farm in Wiltshire, which has been managed outside the family for a couple of generations, but we were also able to take care of the woodland at least. So the farm was taken care of, but the woodland was not. So throughout my teenage years, we were learning sort of how the functioning of the woodland and how to start managing that, first in a very sort of light way without any real proper engagement, but slowly, you know, coming into it. Always been extremely interested in food. So that plays a big role. You know, if you're really into food, then you start becoming interested in where it comes from and how it can be produced better. So that was always there. So the first experience that I think maybe is valid to talk about is in university. So I started to look around. I studied geography. I started to look around, well, how can I study what's going on in the world around me to do with food? And with a view to starting to think, how can I create more beautiful landscapes, more beautiful ways of producing food? It was often about the sort of the aesthetic of being in a place, you know. And in university, I started focusing on analyzing food systems and understanding what are the touch points for making change within those systems. And I started becoming quite obsessed with this question of like, okay, I like the idea of making change, but how am I going to do that? If I look from a farmer's perspective, how do I go from just making a change on a farm to really a large scale change? And I wrote my thesis on that topic, you know, how to make large scale change in the food system in Manchester University. And I started working with the Kindling Trust, who I think are part of the Land Management 2.0 network. Chris Walsh, I think, is in one of the people in charge of the Kindling Trust. And what they do in Manchester is they have an incubator farm for people who want to get into organic agriculture. So they provide them with land and with training to help them to get into organic agriculture. So I did some volunteering with them and wrote my thesis on what they were doing. And they also had a mechanism for selling the produce that was coming from the people who they were helping to grow the organic produce. So they were working with the university, for example. I think it was called Manchester Veg People, if anybody interested. And I think they're still working. They still have their organic incubator program going on outside Manchester. So that was the first experience, and that was really sort of a grassroots movement. And that was just really about agriculture more generally. It wasn't about agroforestry specifically. And then, so, you know, post-university, I moved to the Netherlands, and I was working for a consultancy, or doing an internship for a consultancy called Metabolic. And they were very interested in also in food systems change, or systems change in general. They focused a lot on the concept of circularity. But they decided to set up a food forest as sort of an example of an interesting and sustainable land use. So not really, well, it's agroforestry, but in the Netherlands, agroforestry is often associated with being sort of very complex forest gardens, so not really on farms. But I was able to work with them in the design process and actually establishing this forest garden. And this was 2015. So that was the start of this connection between agriculture and the landscape and productive tree systems. Done a few things here and there with other sustainability consultancy, all related to farming. And I've done couple of extra things that I would think are really important for my journey. One is I've been doing some biointensive market gardening. So when I was in Amsterdam, I was doing biointensive market gardening. I don't know if you know what I mean when I say that.
No, do you want to outline it a little bit?
Yeah, well, so the basic principle is that you are producing on a very small area of land, or on a relatively small area of land, and you're packing in as much crop as possible into that area, not only to get a maximum output and to make it a really profitable system. So it's supposed to be like really hyper profitable market gardening, basically. But the biointensive element comes also from, you have high organic inputs into the soil, and you have a relatively high density of planting. So let's say your carrots aren't spaced this far apart, they're spaced this far apart, so that you get complete ground cover as well. So you're really maximizing the space. And there are a couple of really interesting examples of people doing excellent market gardening, where it's really small scale and really profitable, and you can feed a family off like 1.5 acres, or not feed a family, but have an income for a family for 1.5 acres, sort of thing. And what that really impressed on me was the value of efficiency, because everything in those market gardens has to be planned to the nth degree and really lean, and you're making as few trips to the tool shed as possible, and everything is standardized, but it's on a human scale. So that was the really interesting mix for me. You know, how do you systematize things and standardize things to be efficient, but on a human scale? And then you can start to think, well, how does that come into agroforestry? When you have this like complex forest garden idea, and you combine it with the systematization, you start to ask questions. Well, how can I systematize these relatively complex ecosystems, complex compared to an agricultural system? How do you systematize them to make them applicable for farms? So I started those are experiences that I started to combine and think, well, how do I systematize these beautiful ideas that are never going to work on a farm? Like a forest garden is a wonderful place to be, and it's a great thing to have as your garden, but it's not built for modern farming systems. So I started trying to combine these things, and within, let me see, so the last 2.5 years, I started working with Renature. I don't know if you've seen them. They're doing a really awesome job of communicating about agroforestry. And I was their project manager, or project developer, I would say. And I had the opportunity to work on a really awesome project in Indonesia with the spice company Pretaterra, who were trying to set up an agroforestry system for their white pepper production. And so I was able to go to Indonesia, and I was able to establish this really well systematized agroforestry system for white pepper. It's on 1.2 hectares, but the plan is for the station to scale this system up to about 500 hectares, so that they get like 20% of their pepper supply from there. So that, I guess, was the next step in seeing, okay, these systems can really, these ideas can really be systematized for farms. So that was in Indonesia, and that system was actually designed by Pretaterra, who I'm now working for and representing here. And it sort of drew together all of these ideas of how do you create real agricultural efficiency while getting a structural diversity that is functionally valuable, has a value for the crop and for the landscape and for the farmer. So I don't know if that really answers your question, but that takes us to where we are now. And what I'm trying to do now is to take those agroforestry systems that they're doing mainly in the tropics and in the subtropics, or not the systems, but rather the processes for understanding how you can systematize agroforestry for farms and bring it into a temperate context. So there are some really cool temperate examples of agroforestry, but not that many. And it's still not something which is really well established as something that farmers do. So that's the next challenge, really. That's what we're working on right now, is establishing that.
And Tirion, why do you think that is? So what it sounds like to me from what you just shared is that there is maybe you could call it complex systems thinking that goes into the design of the holding to bring trees in. I mean, actually, to be honest, trees are just one element of that landscape, right? You know, because you talked about horticulture, which obviously sits inside potentially agroforestry if it's designed in that way. But what it sounds like to me is it's quite it's a design-heavy process to make sure that the system works and you have the functional output and obviously makes the income that a farm needs. And I guess maybe what but it sounds like it's eminently possible, you know, and it's actively being done in the tropics. And I was wondering, do you think, is the tropics going to be more appropriate for that kind of, you know, agroforestry setup, or do you still feel that agroforestry could be brought to temperate climates and deliver the same levels of efficiency? Like, how do you think we could bring agroforestry properly into farming systems and genuinely increase productivity and profitability for farms?
I do think so. It does depend on the system. So people in the agroforestry world, there are a lot of people who really home in on the idea of like syntropic agroforestry, for example. That's a big influence on this, on the people I've worked with, which is really complex, and it's successional, and it's really trying to mimic ecosystems, and there are really fascinating ideas in it, and some excellent techniques. But in temperate context, you're limited by a few things. One is the farming context, so you are highly mechanized farming, and that makes a big difference to how you can create a system. And the other thing is just the amount of available energy coming from the sun. You know, solar energy is limited, so you have to think of different processes. There are also different challenges involved, but I do think it's possible. The question is saying, how do we find ways to understand what level of complexity is appropriate? And I think when I'm talking about complexity, it doesn't have to mean 3-10 species on a hectare, you know, anything in that range or more. It can be an arable crop and a single tree, and that increases potentially the complexity of that system. And if that's done in an appropriate way, it can increase productivity and profitability. We need to have a conversation about how we think about productivity, and there are a lot of other changes that need to come in order for it to be profitable. Like, you need to be able to market those other crops and make sure that they fit into your farm economic planning, of course. But let me see. So I've lost my thought.
Well, I was going to say, Tirion, so we've got our 90-acre farm here, which is where I am right now. I guess an interesting thing to explore could be like, okay, so we've got 90 acres, pretty much a blank canvas, like, you know, and we are going to be writing the business plan coming up. So the question would be, okay, if agroforestry is potentially a tool in the toolkit, like, how could we apply, or like, what lens should I look at the landscape through? Like, how should we appraise and potentially backsolve to see where trees do fit into the farmscape, and how do we appraise the profitability? Because I guess you obviously want to appraise the profitability before you actually go and start planting, right? So I guess how would you, as a farmer, like, you know, how do you think, what should my, you know, lens be to think about how we include agroforestry into the farm business?
Well, I think there are two ways that you can see agroforestry in that context. You said 90 hectares or 90 acres? 90 acres, yeah.
Well,
there are going to be benefits from the trees that occur on the landscape scale, and then there are going to be benefits or negative impacts or no impacts on the agriculture itself if it's integrated into farm parcels. We're actually doing a couple of projects right now where we're going from a farm planning stage and able to vision the whole farm, and that's more about identifying the characterizing the whole site and then characterizing individual sites within it. As you might with establishing a woodland, you do sort of an ecological site classification and understand what's appropriate, as well as a classification of the farming system itself. So basically, you have to map out the whole farm, and then map out the distinct areas within that farm, and of course match that as goals. And then, because there are certain things that we know trees do well. For example, if you have more trees in the landscape, you're more likely to have a better water quality coming off your landscape. And that doesn't have to mean trees within the parcels themselves. It can be around on the perimeters of fields or in riparian areas. So that's one opportunity that you can focus on. But then once you've done that whole farm planning, you can start to think, okay, but I'm interested in experimenting with this particular system, let's say wheat and a fruit crop, like, you know, Stephen Briggs with a relatively simple agroforestry system, and do that on a relatively small area of the farm, to test, you know, not only to test how it emerges, but also to test how you can manage working with the tree lines, and even within a few years, you can start to understand what the change in weed pressure might be. So going from that visioning to actually having it on the farm is a gradual process, I think, and we have to recognize that now, because we can't just say, oh yeah, we have all of this data to show you from places in your context or a similar context to yours where they've had these results. That's something that we're lacking. So I would say in your context, it does need to be a step-by-step process for many reasons, not only because of sort of an uncertainty about the agroforestry dynamic, but also changing farming systems. It takes time and it takes a certain amount of energy and so on. So yeah, I would say taking it from the landscape level to the farm level and analyzing the farm, and then going to the plot level and understanding what the opportunities are there. What are the crops on the farm, by the way?
So we're just putting in lucerne, but otherwise it's just grass, so livestock. So Tirion, would it be something like, okay, so we've got, you know, we've not done agroforestry, you know, this is a new approach. We have obviously kind of heard about the benefits. We can visualize the benefits. And then in terms of kind of those small incremental experiments just to test without incurring too much cost or too much hassle, I mean, could that even be something, I mean, who knows, something like, you know, fruit trees along a fence line, or could it be like where would you think, where are like really simple points of intervention? Just, you know, if we're willing to commit 5 years to experiments or whatever it might be, where might be the easiest places to start? Could it, is it something like fruit trees along, you know, fence lines where there's very little impact on the farming system, very little cost really, you know, because obviously as you start to get into fields, that's where you start to have to think about, okay, how are we going to machine the farm differently? So where would be the simplest places just to start? And do you see, you know, if we're putting in fruit trees and we're looking to get, you know, a fruit crop that we're going to sell, I guess maybe slightly how do farmers who maybe haven't been into selling that kind of product start to explore the market, working out what their profit could be on those sold products? Because you can't just assume you're going to sell it. I guess you've got to know, and you've got to know your market. So what would those incremental steps look like that kind of give the landowner, the farmer, the confidence that, you know, they're moving in a sensible direction?
I think your example of the fruit trees along a fence line, for example, is not a bad one. Or, for example, maybe trees along a woodland edge, so you're making the woodland edge less hard, for example, and then it's not within the field, so you don't have to think so much about the management. In your context, if it's for pasture, and if you don't have to mow the whole thing, then maybe having trees around the woodland edges is a simple solution, because let's say the sheep or the cattle can then, after 8 or 10 years, they can start to go and take shelter under those trees, and you don't have to think too much about the management, but they're already getting that benefit from those trees. One of the challenges that we do still have is the subsidy system. So it's still not that easy to get that many trees into a farm parcel and have it still count as agricultural land. I know we're right in the middle of a change, but it hasn't changed yet. So using, for example, fruit trees can be one way of getting over that hurdle a little bit. Because you know, fruit trees can count as agricultural land use as well. On the marketing side of things, it's certainly a challenge. You have to be willing to talk to people. So one of the things that we're trying to explore right now on this pilot farm that we're experimenting with in Wiltshire is doing the work of the market research and connecting with people who are already growing potentially interesting crops. So we can talk a little bit about case studies again later, but Harriet Bell in Dartington, has created a really interesting case study with a model whereby the farmer is not the person doing the managing, they're not the person doing the selling. You find an off-taker beforehand to implement and even manage the system. In this case, it was elderflowers. So Luscombe drinks producers, they produce their elderflowers in an alley cropping system. They are the ones who manage the system. They're the ones who harvest the system, harvest the product. And then, of course, they get the benefit of a more regular elderflower supply, which is in demand right now. So that's a very interesting model. But these things are still in development, so I can't say that there is a simple way for farmers to just do it. I don't want to downplay the challenge involved, but there are certain mechanisms we can explore to make that happen. So connecting with other people who are producing the sort of thing that you're wanting to produce within your area, like let's say find a local apple producer and at least communicate with them about how they're selling things, and maybe you can sell under the same mechanism, for example. Or finding a company like a cider company, for example. Agroforestry could be very good for producing cider apples, because then you don't need to necessarily think so much about the cost of picking and things. You can maybe just sell your apples to the cider company and they can come and pick those apples up for example. They can do all the picking. So there are different ways of getting around it. There is no straight answer, I would say. But
no, that because the other element, I guess, that's coming into the market now is, grants for planting trees. So I guess there's also that if you happen to be in a priority zone for new woodland or new trees, then I guess there's also, okay, you could apply for the grant, you could get the money, you could plant the trees. And I guess the question is, when it comes to, if you are going to put trees somewhere, they've also got to fit into a smart design, right? So even if we say there's no cost to plant, and maybe someone's going to come and plant them for you, maybe it's a local wildlife trust or whatever is going to get volunteers to do that. I guess the other side, and let's say that's just native broadleaf or whatever it might be. I guess, Tirion, the other component to that is, those trees have got to land somewhere, and there's going to be more appropriate places for them to go relative to other places. And I guess maybe, given we know there's a lot of benefits that come from trees, clean water, potentially healthier soils, air, ecology, etc. I guess there's also that question. So where do they go? I mean, it's kind of a question from before, but maybe more with less productive trees. How do you guys appraise, if you've got a bundle of trees, where to put them? Like, what's your design process that you go through? Like, I'm just imagining other farmers, landowners that are listening to this, wanting to go, okay, well, right, we're willing to take on some money to get some trees from the Woodland Trust, but where the hell do we put them? And how would you go about kind of advising them on best location, given it's quite a permanent decision once they're in?
It really is. It really is. I think, I guess I take the sort of precautionary principle that I wouldn't recommend that people would plant trees on their farmland unless they're sure they want to do it. So I guess that's maybe the challenge of going for it from the perspective of, I'm going to get these trees and I have to find a space for them. That's the sort of thing that happened on our farm in Wiltshire as well. And you're just like jamming trees in all over the place. And then is there a tree there? But so the design process that we go through, of course, is we have, when we start talking with a farmer, we'll try to understand what, of course, their farming system, but then also the sort of the potential species that they might be interested in considering. And then we will also add the species that we think that might be suitable for their context. And a key step is understanding the ecology of that tree. So it sounds like a simple thing, but you have to really understand, what is that tree going to look like in X number of years' time? What is the density of the canopy going to be? What's the form of the tree? What kind of management does it need? Because if you plant an oak tree in the middle of your pasture, then you could probably pretty well expect that in 80 years' time, it's going to be a parkland sort of pasture, and you have to sort of understand that implication. Whereas if you want to, plant lime, for example, and then you can coppice it, then that's going to be a very different looking system. So I think the first step always, when you're taking a look at how do I integrate these species into this system, is understanding their functional ecology, how that works. And we have a process for doing that, and it does take a certain amount of ecological knowledge But once you're able to understand the sorts of ecological groups that you have within your biome, for example, then you can start to sort the different species into those groups, and then you can understand, okay, there are going to be certain interactions between this species and the crop or the livestock species that I have there. And from there, then you have some practical considerations of just like, what's the infrastructure on my farm look like? So if I want to plant tree lines, then how wide am I going to plant the tree lines apart so that I can make sure I can get my machinery in between? That's when some very practical considerations step in, as well as something like, what kind of a return do I want from it? So how many trees do I need, and how do they need to be managed in order for me to get the return that I need? So there are all these different things you consider, but it really starts from that ecological understanding of the tree in relation to the thing you're going to put it with.
Yeah, so it sounds like, so there's obviously, so you've got your farm, you've got some sense of where you want to go. Inside where you want it to go, you can see how more trees fit into the farm. I guess what that does, you can say, well, maybe we want fruit trees because we want to have a fruit product to sell, or we want, whatever, another type of tree, maybe for copsing, or maybe we just want to, maybe that's going to get paid by the natural capital market, who knows. But the point is you want to absorb more trees into your farmscape. And then with that, it's of course, okay, cool, well, where are they going to go so that they have maximum benefit that end up not only, well, on the triple bottom line, I guess, so you obviously want environmental benefits coming from it. You want to max those as much as possible. That should help with the natural capital payment. Just economically, you want to be able to sell the products. And of course, you want to have some kind of public benefit that comes from them as well. So that might be ELMS funding. So I guess, so then we're saying that there's a design process that you go through. So where do we want them? Where's the most appropriate place to get the maximum benefit from that tree or those trees? And so that design process, I mean, it sounds, Tirion, from what you're saying, that actually that is quite a nuanced process, that actually there should be a framework to support the design process. And that's obviously something that you guys do. Like, how much do you see farmers should be working with advisors? Because again, design, I mean, it's obviously an incredibly important skill. I'm wondering, like, how should farmers find good quality designers, advisors, to support that process? Because trees in the wrong location could be a pain in the neck for a very long time. So maybe on that practical side, like, how should landowners, farmers find good quality advisors, or what should they be looking for in an advisor to support them?
How to find good quality advisors, that's certainly a tricky one. I mean, fortunately, being part of a community like Land Management 2.0 helps, because it's not necessarily that easy. And this is one of the questions that we're actually really trying to address, is the fact that these sorts of advisors exist for agroforestry much more in tropical and subtropical contexts. That's why we're doing this Pretaterra thing in Europe. How to find good advisors, that's very tricky, because I guess if you're not already involved in the conversations, it can be very difficult. So that's, I think, an emerging role for a community like Land Management 2.0, to be honest. It sounds like a little bit of a cop-out, but you sort of have to be part of that network. There are a few other great resources, like I know Farm Ed, for example, in the Cotswolds. They're starting to not only do themselves, but they're building up a community around it to try and connect people as well, which I think is really valuable. But I don't really have a straight answer for you on like how to find the right advisors.
Well, maybe your point's absolutely right. Maybe it's something Land Management 2.0 could take on. Maybe it is about case studying those projects that have been successfully implemented, maybe documenting the process that people went through, just so there's more available content on how to go about this, because agroforestry is a big part of the conversation now. And it's, what all the time it's not clear on how to do it effectively or successfully. I guess we want as much evidence or information to show how to do it.
Right, exactly. And so I think that, coming back to your other point of the fact that it's a very design heavy process, that's problematic, because you don't want every farmer to be having to pay for an expensive consultant to be doing their work. Like, it's not the sort of burden that your average farmer can necessarily take. So what we're really interested in doing right now is establishing projects which maybe will be more costly right now, but really build the materials and build the network of people who are then able to learn from and influence that and to be able to scale up that sort of advice. So like I say, we're trying to systematize that thinking and the process that we go through in that context so that other farmers can do it for themselves, or maybe with limited support or with peer support, for example. So with other groups of farmers who have already done it, or further along in the process, you know. So that's one of the key things that should come out of these many case studies, is a mechanism for sharing what are the key elements of the design process that I have to go through if I want to make a decent decision on my land, and who do I need to connect with if I need more.
I mean, because I think this is so time. I mean, there's obviously a lot of trees are going to get planted at some point over the next 7 years on farms, i.e., it's agroforestry, right? It's trees on farms, agroforestry, and then those trees have to go somewhere sensible because there's an opportunity cost for the landowner every time. So what we're saying is actually, all those trees that are going to come and hit the landscape, they're going to end up in farms. They've got to be put in the right location to deliver maximum triple bottom line benefit. And we're saying that there has to be a smart design process. Obviously, it's got to be scalable, partly because we don't have agroforestry designers en masse so that every farmer could access them. So we do need to start to find a way of making that process or framework of thinking accessible to people so those trees do end up in the right location. Because there's, a huge downside in them ending up in the wrong location. So I guess, and actually maybe Tirion, this is probably a good point to transition, is so we've got like, the UK is going to be planting trees, and hopefully a lot of the farmers, you know, landowners are going to get paid for planting those trees, and they've got to go in the right location. The question I would love to explore with you is given the UK is in a unique position, because this is only happening because of Brexit, you know, moving into ELMS, et cetera, into the Environmental Land Management Scheme, how can we now start turning the UK into a case study for the rest of the world? You know, we're going to have a lot of land use change coming up, a lot of new payments coming out, and we are in a very unique position globally to get the right infrastructure in place to support the transition and have that as a replicable model that can be made available elsewhere. Do you have any thoughts or insights into how the UK could best put in place the processes that could turn the UK into a case study for the rest of the world, and we could have an exportable model that we share with other countries as they try and go through these same net zero processes?
Well, I think what you're working on with Land Management 2.0 is a very good start. We've touched on a few of the things already for what can we do to make the UK a case study or an exportable model. And the first insight that I would, I guess, share or focus on is that no agricultural system is directly transferable. There are things you can learn from what other people are doing, but it's always going to be applied, reapplied, adjusted in a different context. So I think we need to have serious case studies. We need to have not only case studies, but we need to have a thriving rural industry and based around regenerative land management. So I would say my vision for a rural economy is really based on sort of diversity and coming back to that market gardening thing, a sort of human scale farming system. That doesn't mean non-mechanized necessarily, but it's on an appropriate scale so that you have a thriving community rather than great big fields with one person in a tractor on them, you know, sort of thing. So you need to have that in place, and it needs to be functioning well. And then in order to make it transferable elsewhere, you need to have you need to be able to communicate what it was about that creation process that was so useful. So talking about the agroforestry design process, not only about the dynamics, you need to have an understanding of the specific dynamics between a tree and a crop, but you need to understand what is the process in order to be able to, you know, I need the different bricks to build my own house, as it were. So that can apply for agroforestry. It can apply for all sorts of things. So how to create a sense of shared learning and progress amongst different groups within a landscape. There are processes that you can exemplify for that. So translating those into accessible resources that other people can use and share. And then the thing which you would then say that needs to be added onto that is a way to share them. So a community for doing that. So you and I this morning discussing an international sort of land management 2.0 community, having mechanisms to share those learnings. So you got basically, if we want to be really simplistic about it, you have the real case, which is things are happening on the ground that we believe are valuable. You have the resources and a clear understanding of what it is that's making those function and how to set them up. And then you have networking mechanism to make sure that they are then exemplified and shared in a way that is appropriate. And I know, for example, I worked with an organization who people may have heard of called Common Land, who are really focused on facilitation at the landscape level. So how do you facilitate landscape restoration, mainly through agriculture, but including various different voices from within the landscape into a shared vision of a regenerative landscape? And how do you then build that into a real life functioning regenerative system or restorative system? So you can imagine organizations like that, they have something to share in the way that they do things. And they've been setting up these landscapes in different areas of the world, which are sort of their case studies. But you need to link that into a wider network in order for it to be shared.
And do you think, Tirion, that could be those landscape processes? Do you think that would be I mean, obviously we've got facilitation funds in the UK, farming clusters. Do you see that being like a cohesive landscape design that all the farmers, they co-design the landscape and then they start to implement their specific components and all those processes are documented and streamlined?
Yeah, I think it has to be iterative, of course. And on a landscape level, you can set certain goals. You can understand certain mechanisms that will be useful within that landscape. So, for example, in the pilot project we're doing in Wiltshire, we're thinking of, okay, how can we take this from the farm level to the landscape level, which in this case is the Hampshire Avon River catchment. And there are certain challenges within that landscape that we know are occurring, and we know the point source of those, which is, for example, eutrophication of these waterways by excessive or nitrogen runoff from farms. So you can, in that way, on a landscape level, you identify, okay, farms need to have a way to either reduce their nitrogen input or optimize it or catch the nitrogen runoff or the nutrient runoff. And then you can start to say, okay, there are certain interventions which we know are going to be useful to achieve this landscape goal. Like, for example, I mean, I'm a big fan of agroforestry for reducing nutrient runoff. So I would say, you know, agroforestry in appropriate places on the farm. And then that at least gives you a framework for then going to a specific farm and saying, okay, where are the places on the farm that represent that kind of a risk zone? So, for example, a field on a slope going down to a river. Okay, that's a place where you need to focus on implementing an agroforestry system or implementing a riparian buffer, for example. So going through the landscape level, you can identify certain goals which you want to approach, but then it's still going to come down to the farm level and say, okay, on a farm level, what are the places on this farm where we can most effectively deal with those challenges that we have on the landscape level? And we need a way to connect those two lines of thinking, right?
Yeah, because that's where the change is going to happen, right? Great to talk about landscapes, but if no one's willing to implement the design, then nothing's going to happen. So, exactly. Tirion, this is really, and so just to try and summarize that. So we think that for the UK to become a case study for the rest of the world, we've got to start documenting and case studying these projects that are active. Maybe they're in the UK, maybe they're in Europe, maybe they're in the tropics, but the point is try and centralize some of that thinking. So we have a bank of resources that anyone can tap into to draw out the information they need to think about the design process. Then we need to kind of iteratively design on farms, maybe take simple starting steps. So, whether it's a few fruit trees along a fence line or whether it's, get some funding from the Woodland Trust, but put the trees in a smartish place. And then we kind of learn and iterate. And I guess in the community, if people are doing that together and ideas are sharing, some people are going to make mistakes. But, as long as those ideas are shared or thoughts are shared, then that's fine. So it's about a community endeavor to progress our thinking and how to do this and slowly systematize the process. And as you say, I really like the idea of a human scale, because for me, it feels like it means that farming will be more interesting, right? Because it'll be more hands-on, there'll be more stuff happening and the community will be engaged. which is great for elms because it's all about public benefit. The second thing I feel like it's important in that piece is localizing supply chains. So actually getting people connected to the source of stuff that's happening. I think there is probably going to be a world of transparency that's going to start coming into the farm sector as people become more conscious of where the source of food is, and that's all wrapped into the climate change conversation. So it feels like there are really tangible things, and maybe Land Management 2.0 can do. Maybe we can just initiate these projects, right? We just go and case study 20 or so farmers, I or whoever can interview them, and we draw that information back. The other thought I had is I wonder whether it would be worth us putting on a workshop, more of a workshop style, 1.5 hours, where we actually go through what are the design processes that a land manager should take on to think iteratively about how they might implement trees in their farm. That could be great. It could be, a couple of things. It could be either just a bunch of slides where we just go, okay, step 1, think about this, ask this question, step 2, do these things. Or we could actually do something where we do have a map and we do start like designing and appraising, okay, this is the context of the holding. Trees could go here, or they could do a hedge line here, or we could do individual trees planted here, or woodland go here. So we could actually start to do that. And we could do it potentially as, as like an open Zoom meeting where people can talk and share and we can bounce ideas around. And that could definitely be a community thing that we put on. I'm just thinking how we activate some of these things. So we move it from conversation to reality as quickly as we can, because we are running out of time, because money is going into trees at the moment. And
exactly.
We want to make sure everyone's supported.
Yeah, I totally agree. And that sort of practical shared design work, it can be really informative. And especially if you have, for example, for some projects, we work on decision-making trees. So you've got this starting point and you have a particular goal or a particular challenge. Then you can start to work through this decision-making sort of path. And if you answer this question in this way, you follow that, and if you answer it in the other way. So that's a very clear way of communicating. I'm at this starting point. How do I get to that end point? Okay, I'm going to go that step, and I answer that question, and then I've taken out that possibility and I've focused on that one. So that's a really interesting mechanism. And then, learning by doing is, of course, a fantastic way of sharing. Not only hearing somebody talk, but actually saying, oh, okay, so I have this map. How do I go from this map or this landscape into a real solution? So it would be really interesting to do that. And just one point that I would make. Sorry, go on.
No, go.
No, I mean, with Pretaterra, we are working on these resources, and we're building video resources as well, because we find that's a very intuitive and informative way of doing things. Like you see somebody pruning a tree, it's easier. Well, I think for a lot of people, it's easier to take in that information than reading and seeing a graphic of somebody pruning the tree in the right way. Like a 3-minute video would be much more informative than a 5-page PDF, for example. So we're also working on those resources, and looking for ways to get those out there and to improve them too, to address the things which people want to address, and to learn from other people too. Because we don't. That's one thing. We can't pretend to know everything. It's more about how do we into a context and appreciate that context in order to make decisions. It's not about saying we know how to best do this thing in a particular context.
Yeah, well, why don't we put something like that? Put on a workshop at some point, invite whoever wants to come in from the community, and we go through it together. And maybe we could get someone who's actually done it in the UK, someone that and they and you and John T, Brunny or whatever could all be on there, and we kind of have that conversation, but we do it as a community. I think that'd be great, because it does feel, for me, what you just said is like there is, I've said it already, but there is complexity, and obviously, and we're going to go into the Q&A in just a second, but I'm sure there's a lot of farmers like us, like grappling, like, well, okay, we know trees are the future. We know we're going to get funded for them. We know they produce benefits, which are great. How do we go through it? Because, the advisors aren't out there, and they're expensive if they are out there at all, because they're a premium, they're high demand. We need to be able to empower land managers to make these good decisions. So, this is absolutely brilliant. Well, I guess now, given time, should we jump onto the Q&A? So thank you, everyone who's asked the questions. Really cool. If there's any more questions you have as we're going through, do just shout and we'll try and cover as many as possible. So Peter asked, how do you see agroforestry fitting into a dairy system?
Well, there are a couple of different ways, I think. One would be, how does it benefit the welfare of the animal? And also by benefiting the welfare, it can potentially benefit the yield that you're getting. For example, I don't know where Peter is, but for example, if you have cold winters, then maybe having a wind break or hot summers, having shade in your pasture might increase the productivity of a dairy herd, for example, by reducing those extremes of temperature. That's one way, for example. A slightly less well-established mechanism, I think, in the UK is fodder. So a production of fodder at different times of year or with a different nutritive value. Agroforestry can fit into a dairy system, certainly in that way. And there are a few other extra experimental, but less well-used methods. So for example, you can use wood chip for bedding to replace what you have to pay for bedding, for example, on a farm. I do understand that there are practical issues to making that happen, but there are ways that you can make that happen. I think one of the challenges with integrating trees into pasture is to know what pasture species go most appropriately with the tree species. So, for example, ryegrass is not necessarily the best choice for maximizing productivity in the shade. So there might be a need to readjust the mix of species in the pasture to make sure that you're optimizing the production of pasture underneath the shade of the tree, for example. So there are some practical issues to think about there. If we're talking about arrangement of the trees within the pasture, you can have different potential systems. So we of course have parkland systems, which are the very well-known traditional British grazing systems, where you have very big trees within the landscape and they act as shade. Or you can have alley cropping systems. It depends on the type, or alley-based systems. It depends on the type of farming that you do. For example, if you're doing a rotational grazing and you have tree alleys, then you can graze your cattle through those alleys. And you're able to protect the tree lines with relatively little cost. If you're having to protect individual trees within a pasture from animals, it's very expensive. But if you have lines of trees and you're able to move, you're basically moving the fence as you go with a rotational grazing, then you're going to be moving the fence anyway and creating field blocks as you go. So you have a relatively low cost way of integrating trees into your pasture, and you can have maybe far more trees within your pasture. There are different ways. But,
yeah. And from what you just said, I mean, it does still sounds like for Peter, actually, if, whoever the Woodland Trust are going to fund those trees, I mean, that's again great. You might not want to incur the cost for the trees if you can otherwise get them paid for. So if those trees are going to be functional, they're not going to, because of the fence lines or whatever, the rotational pattern of the cows, then I guess the trees could just be there. Peter gets paid, and then, gets all the other benefits that come from those trees. Okay. And yeah, I guess Peter asked that question quite early on before we started talking about workshops, but I can imagine how, that kind of design process on somewhere like Peter's farm could be really interesting. Just thinking about how trees could be brought into the system. So Peter asked another question. We've got, a few questions. Okay. So Peter just asked, would that be leafy branches actually? So I guess, Peter, you're referring to the fodder, I guess.
Could also be for the, but I mean, for the fodder, yes, leafy branches, and there have been various studies done on the palatability of different species, and there is still some experimentation to be done. But yeah, the leafy branches for the fodder, absolutely. And sometimes, for example, that can be more drought resilient, so it can fill the gap when maybe the pasture isn't producing so well.
Yeah, Peter did say, that's for the fodder he was referring to. So that's great. Okay, Peter, that's great. And Peter actually asked another question. So carbon sequestration under agroforestry, maybe how do we account for carbon sequestration? Has that modeling been done? Can we start to say, well, if these 1,000 trees are planted, it's going to sequester X? I mean, I don't know. Have you got any insight onto that, actually, Tirion?
I have to say, I'm not a master of carbon modeling, but I do know that it hasn't been a mechanism which has been so useful yet. It's a really important mechanism, but there are issues with, for example, pricing of carbon. So how do you as a farmer access those carbon markets in a way that is enough, not so much effort that it's no longer worth it. We do carbon models for our systems, but getting those verified is also a further challenge. So I'm sorry, that's a little bit of a flimsy answer, but there's still work to be done actually on the carbon side of things. And I'm hoping that within the ELMS framework, we're able to do more work to establish, okay, what kind of systems can we expect certain carbon outcomes from, and how do we pay for that?
Okay. Oh, Peter just asked another one. Did you watch A Country File in relation to planting trees and carbon sequestration? I actually didn't. So I don't know, Tirion, if you did as well. I don't know if we're going to be able to add much to that.
In Sweden, we don't have Country File here, unfortunately.
Oh.
It hasn't made it here yet, but it will. I mean, it's going to take the world by storm, I'm sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. So we've got some more questions here. So Tara said, agroforestry design for upland farms. Are there any out there? I don't know if you know if there are any out there, Tirion?
A couple off the top of my head. There's a group of farmers in central Wales who have been doing agroforestry on upland farms. There are a couple, but I would need to come back. Is there a way that I can share resources if I go and find them afterwards?
Yeah, definitely. So if Tara's on the community, on the Land Management 2.0 community, then yeah, I mean, post them on the general channel and you know, and hopefully, Tara, you'll be able to see them there. But that would be great. You know, potentially they would be great people for me to interview or for us to document or whatever, because it'd be good to hear how they're doing it as well. So yeah, Tara, keep in touch on that front. And
we'll... on that point, there are certain benefits. Sorry, Tim. There are certain benefits that I just talked about with the pasture and upland farming. Benefits of agroforestry in pasture for upland farming. For example, if you're in a very exposed site, and you're farming sheep, for example, then agroforestry can be very valuable in that way. I'll send some resources and we can go into it.
Great. Okay. So, Tom, thank you for the question. So, and then we've got Louise. So workshop, recently started doing BS in covering tree plants. Yeah. Okay. Great. So we've got Louise up for doing a workshop. Okay, I think that's how we integrate all the different threads of knowledge. I totally agree. We need to take all of these conversations and push them through some kind of design framework, because somehow these ideas have got to hit the ground. So yes, Louise, well, reach out to me on the Slack community and we can talk about that. Archie, so what market information on tree products is required to develop an agroforestry system in the UK? And actually, Archie asked another question. Most of the tree planting grants exclude productive tree species or cultivars that are non-native that would offer the sort of secondary products we mentioned. How do you think this could be addressed? So yeah, basically what market information, I guess, is one question do we need to have access to? And, you know, how do we access funding to get the right trees in the right place to deliver what we want? So a bit more market information, I think. Any thoughts on that, Tirion?
Yeah, so on the market information, there are a few things that are, first you need to know that you're able to, you as an individual, or if you're going to be doing the selling, then you need to have an awareness of the market. So where you're going to be selling, how you want to be selling it, how much time it takes to be doing that, the cost on the market of different types of products, different levels of processing, for example, the productivity of that species. We work with productivity on an individual plant basis. So we know how many plants are going to go into a particular field. And we understand there's a range of productivity per plant on average. And it's going to come into productivity over this time scale. So it comes first production after 3 years, mature production after 12 years. You need all of that data if you're going to be able to effectively project your ability to actually sell the product. And then market data is going to be what's the price of the different product types, where you're going to be able to sell it, and how you're going to be able to sell it. Yeah, and also the sort of any restrictions on the sale, like you might be, if you can sell to a restaurant, maybe you don't have to put stamps on your eggs or something, which takes out a little element of processing. But if you want to sell them to a shop, then you have to make sure that they're stamped with the date and everything, things like that.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question because, of course, everything we're also discussing has got to fit into a business plan, right? It's going to be hard to justify taking certain investment decisions unless you know what the costs and benefits are. So I guess this market information is critical. And Archie's second point about, are there grants, or the fact that there aren't grants for more productive species, I guess then again it's just another part of the cost benefit analysis, right? There's going to be cost in purchasing those trees, but maybe does the productivity, or maybe does will elms pay for the public benefits that are still derived from productive trees? They're still cleaning water, they're still cleaning air, they're still providing habitat. So Archie, I think that's a good question, and maybe this is a thing again, land management 2.0 can do without burdening ourselves with doing all of the stuff. But yeah, just try and gather some of that core information. I guess people in the community are going to know it, so maybe we just try and hook conversations around it and make that information available to people. So yeah, because
if I may just make one very, very quick point about that, there may be other ways of getting funding. So there may be organizations that can give money that are not directly linked to the government, that may be a little bit more flexible, because you can maybe have a direct conversation with a person more easily rather than having to just fulfill certain criteria. But then we also, I think, have to explore mechanisms for sort of non-institutional funding, at least in the short term. So let's say within a community, is there a way for the community to fund a certain tree planting if you have, for example, a large estate or a group of farms together? How do you create those links to help for the community to maybe support covering the short-term costs in return for the benefits? So I think that there are a few different ways we have to explore this on different scales.
Yeah, I totally, and I think, it still feels like everything we're talking about still comes back to the business planning, the designing, like it's really trying to get, hands dirty on this design process. Last question that we've got, conscious we've gone over 9:30, so hopefully that's okay for everyone. But last question is from Dan, actually, and just, is there any market for tree hay or tree forage? So I don't know if if there's any market for that.
I think that it would be very difficult to find a market. You may be able to establish a niche market for tree hay, but I think at the moment, probably the most valuable use for it is going to be on farm. I would say, and that's a substitution cost, or like I say, a niche market or a local arrangement with somebody who in very close proximity to you needs that. But I've not heard of a well-established tree hay market.
Okay, great, good. Well, I mean, I think we've got to the end of the questions. We've had an absolutely fascinating conversation. I mean, I'm sure I could have, I would love to ask you, another 100 questions, Tirion, because it's been so fascinating. And trees are definitely going to be part of the farmscape going forward. There's going to be more funding available, more incentives for trees to be in the right place. So thank you for kicking this, interview off with, your insights as to how we can most effectively think about trees landing in the landscape. So a few ideas off the back of this. Workshops and, more conversations as the community and maybe a bit more market information and potentially even kicking off a market, who knows. But so just thank you so much for your time. Been great to chat to you, and thank you everyone who joined and the questions that you asked. Hopefully this was really valuable. Feel free to follow up with Tirion or myself on the community channel afterwards. We'd obviously love to keep chatting and co-design the next phase with you guys. So thank you very much. And look forward to the next session. So great. Thank you so much, everybody.